Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Lindsay Griffiths, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Lawyers Network. Thank you so much for being here for today's program, Tariffs, Incentives, and Practical Paths to U.S. Operations, What Global Counsel Need to Know. The ILN is a global association of high-quality, full-service law firms in more than 65 countries, and one of the ways we support our members and their clients is by bringing together thought leaders across jurisdictions to share practical, timely insights on cross-border issues. Today's topic is very much in that spirit. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Pat McCarthy.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We really appreciate it. A very important topic. Given the events and political climate in the U.S. and around the world. As Lindsay said, I'm going to serve as the moderator today. Just a little bit about myself. I'm with Howard & Howard in Detroit, Michigan. I serve as the chairman of the firm. My practice area is business litigation. I have a national practice in the U.S. I practice in virtually all jurisdictions in the U.S., representing business and business owners and whatever disputes they may have from time to time. Let me introduce our panelists that are going to be here, and each will talk a little bit about themselves. Let me begin with Howard Rubinoff from Toronto. Howard?
I'm Howard Rubinoff from Fogler Rubinoff. I practice business law, been a member of the executive committee for years, and glad to be here. That's all I have to say for now, Pat.
Thanks, Howard. And then we have Tim Wittebort. Tim?
Yes, thanks, Pat. My name's Tim Wittebort. I'm an attorney at Howard & Howard. I'm the head of our corporate practice group. I manage about 50 lawyers in our practice group, and I specialize in all different forms of corporate transactions, M&A transactions, real estate, financing. And I'm going to talk about the U.S. side of tariffs. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks. And Will Butler. Will?
Yeah, hey everyone. I may be the one anomaly in this entire group amongst both the panelists and the attendees. I'm the one non-attorney here. So I am Will Butler. I'm the Vice President of Business Development with the Detroit Regional Partnership. We are the regional economic development agency for Metro Detroit. So we represent the city of Detroit plus the surrounding 11 counties and helping to recruit new corporate investment and jobs to this region. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about how companies and counsel can work with economic development organizations as they look at potentially footprint inside the U.S. and in North America, and what economic development organizations can do for you throughout the site selection and incentive process.
Great. Thanks, Will. So we're going to cover a range of topics today from about U.S. tariffs. First, their exposure and the current policy shifts in the U.S. As Will said, some of the federal and state incentive opportunities, some site selection, entity formation, and employment basics, as well as managing cross-border coordination and compliance challenges. And so I think I'd like to, before I get into the meat of this, let me just say, let's save some of the questions for the very end. We'll do a presentation. We'll have plenty of time at the end for some questions. And if you would also like to put some questions in the chat, that would be helpful as well. But feel free at the end to speak up. Let me begin with the U.S. side, the U.S. tariff landscape. And Tim, I'm going to have a question for you to start this off. What are the most significant recent changes in U.S. tariff policy that Global Counsel should be aware of?
All right. Thanks, Pat. Well, before I answer that question, I want to start out by stating that my goal here is not to advocate for or against tariffs imposed by the U.S. Rather, I'd like to talk about some of the justifications behind the implementation of the tariffs, the impact the tariffs have on economy, supply chain restructuring, and then hopefully we can talk about some strategic responses. But Pat, as you know, the 2025 tariffs that were implemented by the Trump administration are being justified as emergency measures to combat drug trafficking, illegal migration, correct trade imbalances, and protect U.S. industry. So with that said, uh, there's a couple of things there's some things that were implemented and that have changed. With respect to the national emergency justification, the Trump administration believes that because of the fentanyl and synthetic opioid trafficking, that tariffs were designed to pressure specifically China, Mexico, and Canada. Sorry, Howard, to curb the flow of precursor chemicals and narcotics that are flowing into the United States from our borders. Also, tariffs were designed to confront illegal immigration and try to leverage our neighbors to enforce their borders. Couple other things. The tariffs were designed to correct perceived trade deficits and create some reciprocity in trade practices. For example, in Europe, the tariffs that we are combating have been in place since the end of World War II to help with the reconstruction of Europe after the completion of World War II. So there's perceived imbalances, and part of the administration's goal is to address those disparate tariffs and try to alleviate some of the non-tariff barriers. So I'm not going to bore you with the tariffs. I think everyone knows they're far-reaching and they range from 10 to 41%, depending upon the country and depending upon the sectoral portions, whether it's automobile industry, steel, aluminum, things of that nature. But to your question, Pat, some of the changes. For example, the Chinese tariffs have been reduced dramatically because of the perceived reduction in the fentanyl-related issues facing the United States. Overall, though, we still have an effective negative 47% rate on tariffs with China. In other words, China still has excessive tariffs on the U.S. There's been a rollback on food tariffs, which is hopefully easing some of the domestic pricing pressures on our trade partners. And one of the most recent tariffs is the U.S. government removed the duty-free threshold for low-value shipments, which was previously $800, which has had a significant impact on small businesses and e-commerce. In other words, so in some, it used to be that anything below $800 wasn't subject to tariffs, but now every product is subject to tariffs, and so that is critical for our trade partners. Our effective tariff rate used to be a negative 2.2%. Now, in the United States, we have a 10.55% advantage in tariffs, which is an average across all imports. So, with that said, it's projected that the United States is going to generate $195 billion as a result of tariffs. That's $195 billion. Which is a significant amount of money, as you know, and the U.S. government's hoping to reduce the deficit, our federal deficit, by $3 trillion over 11 years. So, in essence, one can say that our tariffs are now helping our trade partners helping to reduce our out of control deficit in the United States. But that's, I got to tell you, that's not unique because, and I know times have changed, but back prior to the U.S. even having income tax, it supported itself on tariffs. And so this is a long-standing practice. It's just been sort of made a little more aggressive over the last year and during the Trump administration.
Thanks, Tim. So let's talk a little bit about foreign companies entering into the U.S. How do tariffs impact decisions about supply chain planning and restructuring? Tim?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that go on with respect to supply chain restructuring. a lot of companies are now reconfiguring their supply chain. Firms are, for example, relocating production from their home country to other areas within the United States or within U.S. territories. Um, they Companies are investing in alternative markets, increasing onshore manufacturing onshore in the United States to avoid future tariff shocks. A lot of multinationals are pledging US-based production. For example, Apple has pledged billions of dollars in new investments in the United States, which is really the goal one of the goals of the tariffs. There has been a shift, as I indicated, in e-commerce and small business because of the 800 de minimis exemption that's gone away. What some foreign companies are doing, specifically Canadian U.S. businesses, because of the drop in U.S. orders, they are now offering U.S. No U.S. duties on customers. In other words, the companies are now advertising that they are absorbing the duties and the tariffs, which is in a way to reassure their buyers or their customers, the consumers, that they are not going to be receiving the price increase. The business themselves. There are a lot of companies now are scaling back capital expenditures, or they have been in 2025, which has affected a lot of us corporate and business lawyers. There hasn't been as much business activity. A lot of major investments for industrial manufacturers, they've postponed those. They're not investing as much, once again, capital into any new expansions. And there's been a lot of job layoffs as a result. So that's what some of our trade partners are doing. And there's been significant losses, which is resulting in production reduction. For example, Toyota estimated $10 billion in losses. So the way to offset that is they're cutting production, which means obviously there's going to be less product on the market, which means the costs are probably going to go up. There's been other economic consequences that I'm not going to bore you with, but a lot of companies are working on improving efficiency, increasing the opacity in trade flows, and it's just creating a whole new way of doing business. There's a lot more planning and a lot more focus on efficiency and cost cutting.
Thanks, Tim. So, Howard, let's get the Canadian perspective here from our northern friends. How has the Canadian-U.S. relationship fundamentally changed as a result of tariffs and/or trade wars?
Yeah, I'll share what Tim said. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just going to try and tell you how things have changed between Canada and the United States. And, hopefully some of the things that Canada is feeling and some of the things that Canada is doing, may resonate with what's happening in other countries. So Canada and the United States are the greatest of friends and allies, and that will continue. They've been so for decades. They're massive trading partners. I will give you my thoughts on how the United States-Canada relationship has changed as a result of the tariffs, and some, at least to Canadians, inflammatory comments, and how it continues to change on a daily, if not hourly basis. President Trump suspended trade talks with Canada a month ago due to an ad he found offensive shown in the United States from the Ontario Premier. The President said as a result, he would increase all tariffs on Canadian goods by an additional 10% over and above what was already done. That has not happened. Prime Minister Carney said he was going to meet the president, and such meeting is supposed to happen next week. However, there's no promise of any renewed negotiations. After he was reelected in November of 2024, President Trump said he wanted to make Canada the 51st state and impose never-before-seen protectionist tariffs against its friend, Canada. Those words and actions sparked a wave of national pride and patriotism in Canadians who have sought to defend their country from threats. They're canceling their flights and vacations to the U.S., and they are buying Canadian. They're doubling down on homegrown solutions, choosing Canadian brands, strengthening local supply chains, and reducing reliance on U.S. travel and markets. Canada has very much struggled in the past to diversify beyond the U.S. market, with a share of exports heading south of the border, constantly pushing past 70% for decades. Prime Minister Mark Carney is setting out to buck the trend with a stated goal of doubling non-U.S. exports by $300 billion in the wake of the president's trade war. The Prime Minister also just last week entered into a memorandum of understanding with the province of Alberta to build a pipeline to the West Coast to sell oil and gas to the Asian markets. This is to further diversify the export of our natural resources away from the United States. In my view, this never would have happened except for the tariffs, in particular with a Liberal government in Canada who's extremely environmentalist. I think one of the big things, I think Tim touched on it, is uncertainty. The relationship between Canada and the United States has shifted from decades of deep integration and predictable trade under the North American Free Trade Agreement to a new era marked by volatility. Tariffs, trade wars, and political uncertainty have eroded trust and disrupted supply chains, forcing Canadian businesses to reduce reliance on U.S. markets. While the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico agreement still provides a framework for tariff-free trade, tariffs on specific products, including steel and aluminum, and the non-U.S. content of finished motor vehicles remain subject to U.S. tariffs up to 50%. The U.S. targeted approach to tariffs on Canadian exports have left Ontario's manufacturing economy most exposed. Increased steel and aluminum duties are straining cross-border commerce, and the uncertainty triggering job losses, as Tim said as well, market instability, and foreign competition of cheaper products into Canada. The desire to avoid tariffs and supply chain issues have many Canadian companies considering moving operations to the U.S., which you'll hear more about later. One client of mine who is a large project management company who has a Canadian parent and a U.S. sub. They do very large projects. They have advised us that they would like us to look at how you change a Canadian parent to a Canadian sub and basically switch it around so the U.S. becomes the parent, and they believe in the present climate, having a U.S. parent is going to be better for them for business. It's one of the things that people are looking at, as well as, again, as Tim said, to look at maybe getting a sub into the U.S. and maybe trying to manufacture in the U.S. And our client never would have thought of this at all without the change in the relationship that I talked about. I just want to say a little bit about, I've already said that on October 23rd, the president canceled trade negotiations with Canada in the wake of Premier Doug Ford's ad campaign, which was arguing that U.S. President Ronald Reagan would have opposed Trump's tariff policies. That was not taken kindly by the president. And hopefully, when the prime minister and the president meet, they can get over that. There's two smaller things I want to talk about, not smaller things, but two things I want to talk about specifically, and that's the cross-border travel. The U.S. tourism industry, especially border towns, are making a concerted effort to win back Canadian visitors, with numerous destinations rolling out new initiatives, advertising campaigns, and other incentives, including taking the Canadian dollar at par or at least giving some discount. The U.S. tourism faces $5.7 billion U.S. loss as Canadians continue to stay home. Canadians traditionally make up the largest group of international tourists to the U.S., totaling 28% of its over 72 million visitors in 2024. According to Statistics Canada, the number of Canadian residents coming back from the U.S. by car in August of 2025 dropped 34% compared to the same month last year, and returning by air from the U.S. fell over 25%. Canadians are going elsewhere other than the United States including traveling within Canada. And just opening remarks, Pat, I'd just like to finish with some comments on alcohol, if that is okay. The LCBO, which is Liquor Control Board of Canada, or sorry, Ontario, sells about $1 billion worth of U.S. alcohol annually and is no longer stocking products like Kentucky bourbon, California wines, and other American spirits. This retaliatory measure, which has been in effect for 8 months, halts the sale of more than 3,600 U.S. products from 35 states. It's estimated that exports of U.S. distilled spirits is down 62% over the first 6 months of 2025 from the same period in 2024. Citing U.S. trade data, exports of American wine were lower by 67%. Wine Institute, a trade group representing California-based wineries, estimated that in 6 months this year, U.S. wineries have lost more than $173 million in export value. The ultimate outcome of this trade war remains to be seen. Thanks, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. So I know you had mentioned the strategy that your client is using to switch the parent and the sub. Are there any other strategies that Canadian companies can use to mitigate the tariff exposure when entering into the U.S.?
Yeah, there's still, although there's an average of 35% tax on most Canadian goods, most are still exempt under the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, which I know the president wants to redo or perhaps get rid of. And I know there's a number of U.S. politicians that don't want that. The problem with this, Pat, is that there's a really compliance nightmare with this, something called rules of origin. And to qualify for the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico agreement eligibility and maintain supporting, you have to maintain supporting documentation for these custom audits, which I understand now are becoming more, they're doing them more, and the paperwork is onerous and complicated. And I think, as people know, in the auto sector in particular is extremely difficult to figure out what parts are what. And I understand they go back and forth between the border 6 or 7 times. So that's a difficult thing. So people are looking at existing supply chains and considering sourcing or modifying product assembly locations, maybe in the US, or to fit a lower duty classification. Government relief, and there's some programs that Prime Minister Carney just last week, as I said, this is a daily occurrence. Last week, I did some government relief incentive programs, and I can get into those in a little bit. One thing also that we've been asked to look at is looking at contracts is the clarity of who pays the tariffs, because they go up and down so much. And you might not have thought about it as a big deal before, but I think now you really have to look at those contracts and say, who's going to be responsible for them. Also, there's been custom delays and more penalties and agreements as well that might be. And as Tim said, everybody's looking to see whether or not it makes any sense whatsoever to move some operations to the United States.
Great. Thanks, Howard. Let's talk more on a global impact now, and maybe Tim and Howard, you can comment on this as well. Are there any anticipated policy shifts that could affect planning for 2026 and beyond?
I will tell you that everything we're reading is that tariffs are going to remain a structural feature of our trade policy for 2026. There may be some relief in certain targeted trade deals, like, as Howard mentioned, the USMCA. Some of the baseline tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, could even rise, depending upon what deals are cut with specific countries. There's going to be probably some specific product tariff hikes as well. But one thing to keep in mind, the tariffs in general and the rationale or the legal rationale used by the Trump administration have been challenged legally. And so the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, will be issuing a decision as to whether Trump had the legal authority to impose these tariffs. I don't know of anybody who can project what the Supreme Court's decision is going to be. There are 4 or 5 different legal rationales or support that the Trump administration uses. But the Supreme Court's going to be reviewing is whether the president exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which basically addresses whether there is actually an economic emergency, as Trump and his administration has declared, regarding and that's the reason for imposing the tariffs. And that goes back to the fentanyl crisis, and that goes back to the issue involving immigration and some of the other issues involving military components and pharmaceuticals and the rising cost of pharmaceuticals. So we'll see how that plays out. If the United States Supreme Court rules that Trump's imposition of tariffs is not supported by law, we've got a whole bunch of new set of problems. Number one, what do we do with the funds that we've collected? Do they have to be returned, or will it be a retroactive decision? Will it be a decision that, moving forward, no more tariffs? Not to mention that for those of you who may not have heard, Trump has announced that there will be $2,000 dividend checks to a certain segment of the population of the United States in 2026, which is an effort for the administration to share in some of the benefits of increased tariffs and the revenue generated from the tariffs. So it could create a whole new set of legal implications for the administration and the U.S. as a whole. I'm hoping that Trump doesn't issue those dividend checks before the Supreme Court rules. I mean, I don't know how you would go back and recoup some of that money, but it's going to be, it could create quite the dilemma. So, I mean, we don't anticipate many changes going forward in 2026 in terms of whether we'll have tariffs. There may be some slight adjustments up and down regarding specific countries and specific products. But as I think, as everyone knows, Trump is not the most predictable elected official the United States has ever had. And that's sometimes good and that's sometimes bad. I mean, let's be honest, Howard, one of the unintended benefits of the tariffs to Canada is there's less alcoholism.
Yeah, just drinking more Canadian wine. I think, Pat, one of the things, and I briefly mentioned it, and I'll just give a couple things that the government has done, because that's what I think is going to happen if this continues, Pat. There's going to be more government intervention in trying to balance this. And as I said, looking for other markets. They pledged to double Canada's non-EU exports in the next decade. So, as I said, this is a daily occurrence. So on November 26th, just last week, I'm kind of reading a news article here. The Prime Minister announced support for Canada's lumber and steel sectors in light of the tariffs. The federal government is offering $500 million in loan guarantees to Canada's softwood lumber industry and placing limits on imported foreign steel. Ottawa is cutting back on steel imports from countries that do not have a free trade agreement with Canada from 50% to 20% of last year's levels. This will apparently open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel. Canada reduced tariff-free steel imports from non-Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade area partners from 100% of 2024 levels to 75%. Canada will also impose a global 25% tariff on targeted imported steel derivative products, such as wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners, and wires to grow demand for Canadian-made steel. Canada is also cutting freight rates for transporting Canadian steel across provinces by 50%. So I'm thinking that these type of government incentives and government programs are probably going to continue, but I have faith that Canada and the U.S. will enter into an agreement that will be beneficial to both parties.
And Mexico, I would assume.
And Mexico, sorry, yes. Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about incentives and site selection, and I'm going to turn to Will for the next question here. And Will, I know you're in Michigan, so let's start with a Michigan-related question. What types of incentives are available for foreign companies relocating operations to Michigan?
Yeah, sure thing. And maybe just prior to that, I'll give a little bit of not quite soapbox, but maybe some personal advice or guessing on my side, which is a few things. One, I anticipate, so this is not company line, this is out of Will Butler's own mind, but I anticipate that tariffs, while there will be shifts and changes, this may be a landscape and waters that we all have to navigate, even post the Trump administration. So that would be my one sort of comment is that I think this is going to be sort of an ongoing landscape that businesses and those that counsel them are going to have to navigate through continually. And from my side, from my vantage point, I think where you see the U.S. federal government taking maybe more of a stick approach to encouraging investment inside the U.S. borders. What this environment means is that the importance of subnational relationships at the state and local level become really, really important because, truthfully, that's where the carrot is in the United States. That's where, to your point, to the question, Pat, right, that's where the incentives are in the United States or at the state and local level. So I'd be advising businesses that I don't think this is something you can wait out for 3 more years. And I think this is something that you need to, if you don't already have existing state and local level relationships inside the United States, where you may already have facilities or where you may be thinking about facilities, those are relationships you probably want to start building now. So that's my perspective, I think, on the broader sort of, the importance of where economic development fits into this. Obviously, so I'm doing a little bit to try to represent that at a more national level. But my expertise, obviously being here in Michigan, is on the Michigan toolbox. So, happy to dive deeper with anyone who's got, really in-depth questions on kind of Michigan incentives. But in general, what the state of Michigan has really done around its toolbox at the state level, it's relied on a cash grant primarily based on job creation, where it is direct disbursements of cash to companies as they meet performance metrics kind of over a 3 to 5 year period, has been kind of our standard bearer flagship tool for a long time. At the local level, you see a lot of real property or personal property abatements for projects, and then workforce and training dollars as well, some of which exist federally, like on-the-job training. Those are federal programs, but you have some unique Michigan-based programs that can help build, pots of funds that companies can tap into for training and workforce development. The one thing I will say to those on the call who are advising companies who may be looking at potential operations in Michigan, we do have an ongoing bill moving through our legislature right now that would provide actually take the income taxes from new employees in Michigan and divert that back to the employer. And depending on the bills that are currently going through the legislature, that could be up to 50% or up to 100% of the income taxes from those new employees could go up to the employer for a period of, 5, 10, and ongoing years. So we might have some new tools coming to fruition as well. And the last thing I'll say too is, for more project specific or municipality specific, possibilities of free land, right? Or leveraging, LDFAs, local development financing authorities to help fund infrastructure, potential, utility rates that might be more economic development rates. I mean, those are all things that are a little more project specific, but that's a general sketch of the incentive toolbox here in Michigan.
Hey,
Thanks.
Pat, can I put a plug in for Will in the strategy?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think so the folks understand, uh, Will and his organization, not only do they provide the advice and counseling to moving to Michigan, but they help make significant and material introductions to folks that can also provide assistance, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at local level of governments, whether it's staffing companies, whether it's real estate companies that help find real estate, and they do it all at no cost. I mean, there's no charge to the company. And it's a service that is very comprehensive. So I just wanted to make that plug for Will, because I think it's very unique. what they do and at no cost. So I just thought that was worth because Will wasn't going to pat himself on the back, so I did it.
I appreciate that. No, thanks, Tim. That is right. That is often when I am always saying like, not a traditional sales call. I'm not here to make you sign a contract. We are indeed a free complimentary service paid for by some private dollars as well as some public dollars to let us do this work.
All right. Well, thanks, Will. Thanks, Tim, on that. So let's go beyond Michigan for a minute here. How
Yeah.
do the incentives compare to other U.S. regions, jurisdictions?
Yeah. So, again, to give a little practical advice, I mean, I do think there are a group of US states that I would say qualify as in the game, right, around economic development, and a group of US states that generally tend to sit out. It doesn't mean that toolboxes and, tools aren't available in all states and locations for companies who may be placing footprint or headcount in those locations. But generally, you find a batch of states in the Midwest and in the Southeast and a little bit in the Southwest as well that are active, right? And very active in proactively finding corporate investment, finding projects, supporting those businesses, and providing, strong financial incentives to do so in those locations. So Michigan is not the only state that does this, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to tell everyone on the call that we are. But I think we're kind of in a group of states as you look at our competing Midwest states, Ohio and Indiana. You look down in the Southeast, so South Carolina and Georgia, right? Really active. Obviously, Texas, incredibly active in this, and Arizona. For Michigan, I think we're among those states. You look at some of the rankings, CNBC top 6 state for doing business. You look at Area Development Magazine, which is kind of like the trade publication for people who do facility planning, right, and planning out new footprint. We're number 10, right, in terms of best states to do business. So I would say Michigan is active, is pretty robust and pretty strong, and is looking. And while we're not the only state doing this, right, we want to compete and we want to put together a package to help ensure that investment can take place here in Michigan. And that's true. The last thing I'll say on this is, that's driven a lot by the fact that clearly we have a legacy industry that is really strong here. But we need to retain that, we need to grow that, and we need to grow future technology. And obviously, I'm talking about the automotive industry here, right, and the manufacturing industry. And so that's where you see kind of our hunger and aggressiveness around economic development.
So I know both you and Tim just touched on it briefly here, in terms of economic development organizations, maybe give a little bit more specifics on how your organizations and others like it in other states help companies navigate site selection, for example, or compliance issues.
Yeah, for sure. So the one thing I'll say as a little maybe unfortunate to those who might be advising their clients here in the United States, economic development tends to be a little decentralized, right? So economic development is uneven and decentralized, right? Not all states and their economic development efforts are created equal, and then same at the regional and kind of local level. So my organization, again, we are a regional entity. We're multi-jurisdictional. We represent the city of Detroit and 11 counties. It's 5.5 million people of Michigan's 10 million population. And obviously, the biggest population center in the state, the biggest economic center in the state. The one positive is those economic development organizations like ours in the U.S., the tradition is that is a complimentary service, right? So that is a free service built for companies to support them. So while it's difficult to find kind of, okay, who is the right entity, who covers exactly the territory I'm looking at, right? Who maybe has the resources. Once you find them, that is going to be free support. And to Tim, thank you again for the pat in the back. It's going to be comprehensive and pretty wide ranging. So, frequently we're tip of the spear a lot with companies and their team, including their attorneys, and helping them understand data. What are the wages? What are taxes? How do we compare against other locations? We're helping identify real estate along with real estate teams and brokers. We're helping to put together incentive packages and advise clients through the incentive process and really handle them through that. We're helping with staffing and recruiting, whether that's making connections to universities and community colleges, or Tim mentioned this, making connections to staffing companies, and then we're helping go through the permitting, whether that be at an environmental level or just getting through a variance at the local level. And one of the things that I take as sort of a personal ethos in this job is we're here to be an advocate on behalf of the business. And so part of our job is always to advocate, right? And whether that's at a local planning commission meeting or whether that's supporting the company and advocating for them as they look at community integration, right? Not just landing, but actually, becoming an employer of choice inside a community is something that we're really trying to help a company guide through.
So, well, these are all great things you're talking about, and everybody likes to have a success story. Why don't you give us an example of a success story where you've helped foreign companies leverage these incentives efficiently?
Yeah, for sure. And I know we're talking about this in the context of tariffs, right? And so, the I think what's tough right now is certainly we do have companies who are now taking an active look at the United States and at Michigan because of tariffs. We have a Canadian food and bev company that is looking at duplicating their Canadian operations in the United States because of this. We have a Korean company that's recently hit by copper tariffs who's now looking at a U.S. production facility. So we are seeing this activity, and where I feel for businesses is to do that in a way. I think Mary Barra said this, the CEO of GM, of trying to find ways to do this by making non-regrettable decisions, right? That can be tough to find non-regrettable decisions, but that can be, something you can feel good about through the future. So on that point, a company that we recently supported is a French automotive supplier called Moldtex. They're a plastics part supplier. They were facing this exact issue, right? They had planned a production facility in Mexico, realizing that they were going to, that being their only North American production, they were going to have, massive tariff implications and massive tariff exposure for their parts. And so they went about trying to find a way that they could at least mitigate some of that. Luckily, and I realize not everyone has this luxury, they had a sister company that was in Michigan, and there was an ability to kind of strike a deal to use some excess space inside that sister company in Michigan for potential U.S. production. But there was a financial gap to doing so, right? In comparison to having everything in Mexico, right? Now you have an increased CapEx as you're looking at putting some of that in Michigan and also doing your Mexican production facility. And that's where the state toolbox came in, right? Was really to help solve that gap and making this a little more of an even transaction, a little more of something that could be palatable to their board of duplicating some of that production. And so we're glad to say Moldtex came through and now has production in Auburn Hills, Michigan, where they are on their way to hiring up to 100 employees. Just for like a point of, data point, that was $1 million in cash that they received for about 100 employees. We have others, right, that may be less tariff specific. A German automotive supplier named Lepla. We helped them rapidly come into the market in just about 9 months, find a facility and start their supply to Tesla. And so some other case studies, but I want to bring up that one just as a real tariff mitigation strategy that Moldtex pursued.
Thanks, Will. That was great. So let's maybe try to pull some of this together and get maybe some practical steps that global counsel should be taking when advising clients on U.S. operations. And I'll open this up to everybody.
Howard, if you don't mind, there's some things you can do, right? That companies can do. They can shift manufacturing from high tariff countries like China to some more tariff-friendly regions. Preferably we'd like them in the United States and Michigan, but if not, there's Vietnam, India, Mexico. You can do some nearshoring, which means they can move some of their production closer to U.S., like Mexico or Canada, and then take advantage of some of the benefits of the USMCA, including lower shipping costs. You can invest in some of our regional or domestic manufacturing operations. If a foreign company does want to come to the United States, there's some things to keep in mind. Where do you create the entity? What type of entity? Is it a C corp? Is it an LLC? Is it a joint venture? You have to look at tax considerations. You have to look at whether there's any kind of trade, any kind of agreement with the country. For example, we helped a Romanian window manufacturer come to the United States. We had them incorporate in Delaware, but interesting because of the tax treaty, they could not be a subsidiary. It wasn't beneficial for them to be a subsidiary of the Romanian company. So we did is we set up an entirely new company, and various principals of the Romanian company were actually the principals and equity owners of the new U.S. company. But that was for tax purposes. Howard, there's strategic approaches when it comes to U.S.-Canadian relationships and trying to mitigate or avoid negative tax implications. There's things you can do, and you just need to make sure that you look at the type of entity, and it's based on the type of trade or agreement we have with your country, and then you go from there. But there's a whole host of things that foreign companies can do, and when either Howard or we can always assist. Will can assist in that.
Yeah, I think relocation, Tim, or putting a sub or something, it's looking what best fits your supply lines and what you're trying to do, and tax and the structure that you want is always extremely important. I always kind of ask the clients, where's the money going? Is it staying in, or is it going across border, or is it going somewhere else? We're talking with a Swedish company on Thursday. They're thinking of moving and putting a sub here as well. So those are all type of things that you have to look at. And there is good benefits, as Tim said, that between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. and all kinds of different things, notwithstanding what's been going on now, there's still a lot of things that can help out other countries.
It's not just money going back; it's money coming in. For example, China, you cannot take money out of China and bring it to the U.S. And we're advising a Chinese company now, and so instead of setting up a facility here because they can't get the funding, they're going to set up a facility in Vietnam. But there's more favorable trade agreement with Vietnam so that they can avoid some of the restrictions that the Chinese government has imposed on them. So there's different avenues.
Before we open up to questions from the group, why don't we just talk briefly about how can legal and business teams collaborate to ensure a smooth transition into the U.S. market? And I'll open that up to anybody who would like to address that.
Yeah, maybe I'll put a selfish plug here is that I think economic development organizations, Detroit Regional Partnership, right? If Michigan and Metro Detroit are being considered, they're part of the project team. And I would encourage the attorneys here or corporations here to view economic development as part of the project team, because they can be really beneficial in thinking about additional tools, right? I mentioned the advocacy point, right? And whether that's local advocacy or potentially at the state legislature level, right? They can be on the ground intelligence, right? Of whether that's on the real estate side of things that might be off market, or whether that's right a soon to be closure that might provide a workforce opportunity for the company. So I would maybe selfish plug that I think sometimes is frequently not thought of. Economic development as part of the project team as they look at adding footprint and headcount.
Yeah, a couple things, Pat. Also, and Howard touched upon this, your agreements with your customers and your vendors. Howard's right. There's a lot of agreements that we look at that don't address tariffs. Now, is a tariff a tax? Oftentimes, provisions and agreements, put the burden on one party if there's an increase in tax. But arguably, tariffs aren't considered a tax. So you look at how you absorb price adjustments. Does one party agree to absorb it? Do they share in the price adjustments? So that's part of it. I think there's going to be some promotional strategies, duty free, free shipping, things like that. And just like Will said, working with local folks who can help navigate some of the the regulatory issues and hopefully offset some of the costs with incentives, because there are a lot of incentives out there that companies can take advantage of.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Um, this might be a good time to open it up to any questions that the attendees have. You can put it in the chat. You can speak now. It's all fully absorbed.
We will make all of the panelists' information available after the webinar. So if you do have questions that come to you once you've had a chance to digest this a little bit, you can feel free to reach out to all of them directly.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Okay. Well, great. Anything else that anybody would like to add?
Don't think so from my end, Pat.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate your attendance, and hopefully this was helpful. And if you need some help in the future, you've got quite a few good advisors and team members here that can help you out.
Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for the excellent insights today and to all of you for joining us, as Pat said. And we hope this discussion gave you a clearer, more practical understanding of the current U.S. tariff landscape, the incentives environment, and the key considerations for clients who are exploring or expanding their U.S. operations. We will be sharing the recording and the materials with everyone who is registered, as well as more broadly. So as I said, if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to connect with any of our speakers, please feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.